So we will now have another conversation. I don't know if we can compete with what came before. That will be very, very difficult. But we'll try. And we've asked Tariq Ali to come because of by extreme coincidence and fortitude. He's just published this book called The Extreme Center, A Warning, which is about the crisis of democracy mainly in Europe. You could say caused by neoliberal reform, or you could say it's caused by the stuff that was drawn up before in terms of mass movements, weakness of the bourgeoisie, and a kind of fascist state formation. I guess you could also frame it in those terms. So we will, I think for me, what was fascinating reading the book was the way that it's structured. It has 6 chapters, but how they are in a way in pairs, and they're kind of mirrors. So the first one is called English Questions, but then followed by Scottish Answers. I think you can guess what's going on there. We can talk about that in a minute, I think. Then the second ones are the quite depressing reading, which is about basically the NATO and the EU and the political functions they perform. And then finally, it's a very interesting chapter, chapter 5, on the possible waning of American hegemony, which you resist quite strongly. I think you even call it a kind of optimism of the left. And that's sort of mirrored with something called Alternatives, which among other things writes about Syriza, so we could maybe return to that. But I think the first thing I would like to talk about is probably the what is the extreme center?
For me, the extreme center, it's a sort of phrase I invented because people often talk about the extreme left, the extreme right, but very few and the center is somehow in the political imagery seen as benign, that because it's the center, it's fine. And what I point out is that the neoliberal world has created a political form which is different from what existed before, in the sense that not even minor alternatives to the neoliberal system are permitted by the political structures of the day or by the state. And so what we have seen is whether it's a left-center party or a right-center party, the politics are exactly the same. And why the extreme center? Because they make war, first against their own people, in the austerity measures, structural unemployment. Then they fight America's wars in different parts of the globe, Middle East, Africa, Europe, wherever it's necessary. And C, they have an increasingly authoritarian ideology, which is reflected in a large bulk of the mainstream media, which reflects very faithfully the extreme center and its politics, and anything outside that is not permitted. So to raise a question of, say, like, which a majority of people in this country want, renationalizing the railways, is considered totally and completely crazy, because it challenges the market once again. And it's not simply something that we see in Britain. The second aspect of it, more globally, is that it reflects the globalization stroke Americanization of European and world politics, because this system of two political parties who basically do the same things comes from the United States for a very long time. The Democrats and the Republicans. One can be more horrible in the way in which it explains it, and the other can do it with a nice face. And Obama was the most inventive apparition of the American extreme center. But they're seeing through. I mean, he's been seen through as well. And so we have seen gradually the Americanization of European politics, not just politically, but also culturally. In the huge decline of the independent cinema in countries like Germany, Italy, France, to a certain extent, Britain, which had its own cinema, all this is increasingly globalized, and the American television soaps, mostly bad, some good, conquer the world. Not just in Europe, but the world. I mean, a footnote here, that North Korea, which is often treated as the worst state in the world, though there are many others I could name, but here we have a sort of strange dictatorial authoritarian state with a leader who is completely obsessed with American soaps. So that he sits and watches, because he can watch whatever he wants, and got completely obsessed with Breaking Bad. And then he, after watching the whole show, he then called in his scientists and said, this thing they show in the film crystal meth, can we make it? And the scientists said, well, we can make nuclear weapons, of course we can make it. And the North Korean state is today the largest supplier of crystal meth to the whole of Southeast Asia, so much so that the Chinese are asking them to clamp down because it's flooding into China. So here you see a very clear link between an American soap opera plot linked to an authoritarian state and actually helping the economy of that state. So what I'm trying to show is that even the countries which claim to be the most hostile to the United States, I mean, this is an extreme example, come under its influence in one way or the other. And this extreme center, in order to be challenged effectively, usually requires mass movements. It can't just be done in the traditional way of setting up a small group and hoping for the best. You require mass movements, and the economic crisis of 2008, after some time, a delay, is slowly beginning to produce these movements. And the last point on this, I mean, we'll discuss it again, is that because you have large-scale youth unemployment, and because the break with traditional political parties is so strong, whether these movements go to the left or the right is often accidental, depending on what exists. Spain doesn't have a far right, because most of it was incorporated in the successor regime of Franco in the PP. That's where all the Franco people went. And so the example of Podemos is they don't have a far right to contend with. In Greece, you have a far right, quite vicious and openly fascist, unlike the other European proto-fascist groups. And against this, you saw that a section of the left uniting and finally winning the victory, which we recently observed in Greece. So it's not that the extreme center can't be challenged. Challenging it requires a fight on many different levels, especially the political level. And it's this aspect which sometimes worries me, that the political has become more or less forgotten over the last 20, 30 years, since 91, that there's been a huge retreat from politics in history. And now slowly it's coming back again. And without having an understanding of the political and what is going on, you cannot combat it by a counter-political. That's the situation we have now. It's an uneven and variable situation, and that is effectively what I argue in the book. And of course, as Simon pointed out, it's the United States empire which is the dominant feature of world politics today. It's for the first time in the history of humanity that we have a global empire. A global empire which rules in different ways, not necessarily by direct conquest and direct occupation, though it is moving in that direction more and more, but usually by local relays and collaborators. That has been the big difference between the American empire and the preceding European empires. And I warn against any illusion mongering that suggests that this empire is in terminal decline as an imperial project. There's absolutely no evidence for it. Setbacks, yes, but terminal decline, either economically or militarily, is not the case. It remains very strong, and it has on its flank the European Union, which backs it and which depends on it to remain the global policeman of the world capitalist system. It can't do it exclusively because China is not prepared to be policed like that, and Russia now is striking out on its own, but by and large, that is what goes on. The system needs a global policeman. Only the US can be the global policeman. The Europeans can't do it on their own. They would either break up or one dominant power would rise in Europe again.
So you, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what it is that you see preventing this demise, partly economically and then of course militarily. With those two aspects, because you write quite well, I think, of the military strengths. But
well, militarily, the United States has no rival. I mean, it has the power to destroy the whole world with the pressing a few buttons. And I'm not joking, because technology now is so advanced that you press 6 buttons and you wipe out the world. Obviously, some will try and hit you back, but you know, the technology and the size of the US military is huge. US military expenditure is more than that of the next 6 or 7 countries put together. And that includes China, Russia, whatever you want. So this is unchallengeable, and they are way ahead. The Chinese military is largely a defensive business. Any attempt to attack China, they will defend their country. Likewise, the Russians and their periphery. But in terms of any thought of defeating the United States militarily, it's virtually impossible. Virtually impossible. Economically, of course, they've suffered with the Wall Street crash of 2008. But they've partially recovered. But it's more important to understand that while the US, like Europe, has been deindustrialized and China is effectively the workshop of the world, on the key economy, if you look at the key aspects of the US and European economies combined, they are still very strong. One shouldn't underestimate that. And on the system generators, what they call the system generators, the US and the West is totally dominant. These are, for instance, spare parts for planes, the production of aeroplanes, the production of high-grade weaponry, many, many other things like this. If you look at the statistics, they're totally and completely dominated. China is right at the bottom when it comes to that. So where it matters for them, not to mention if you take Apple, the huge computer giant, a lot of irrelevant things, relevant but not key, are produced in China, South Korea, Japan. But the heart of the technology is owned and controlled by the United States. So Apple China is an American company, and they go there for cheap labor. But the control of Apple as an American company is not challenged and not challengeable. So within this context, the American citizens become extremely important players in terms of how that country will develop. Obviously, outside events will have an impact, but by and large, it's what American citizens do that has the impact. I mean, I was in New York recently discussing some of these issues, and people were a bit despondent, and a guy who was interviewing me said, but nothing ever happens here. I said, well, things happen, but not systemically. You have movements which challenge aspects of the system, but we have not had a movement which has challenged the system as a whole in the United States since the Civil War, because that Civil War did challenge the particular structure which the Northerners wanted. I mean, slavery was a byproduct, but that's the only thing that's talked about. But effectively, the North fought a civil war to make sure that America was united. And there were many who argued that they should take Canada as well, and they did think about it. And now they've got it economically, so it doesn't much matter whether they took it or not. So in that sense, the ideology of the American ruling class is never really been challenged except by small groups. The biggest challenge came during the Vietnam War. And this was not a systemic challenge to the US system, but it challenged the imperial project. And this was symbolized by 200,000 GIs in their uniforms, many veterans on their crutches, wearing their Purple Heart medals, demonstrating outside the Pentagon in 1971, I think it was, and chanting outside the Pentagon that they wanted the Vietnamese to defeat America. That is pretty unique in the annals of imperial history. We never had such demonstrations when Britain was a huge imperial power, or France, or Belgium, but the American structures, because of a conscript army, because they were losing the war, were a classic example of how a political, ideological defeat and a severe military setback in a Southeast Asian country impacted on the soldiers who were fighting there. And these soldiers took it home. I mean, black soldiers who came home and found the country just as bad as it had always been used to have a famous chant. I ain't gonna go to Vietnam. No, what did it say? Hell no. I ain't gonna go to Vietnam because Vietnam is where I am, meaning the ghettos of American cities. And this link between domestic and expansionist imperial projects really clashed during the war. And for a time, many people at that time, because it was a huge setback, said the American empire is finished. Now they will never ever intervene again. Many people wrote that, but they did, as we see. So on this question of declinism, I advise caution that it's not necessarily going to happen. And of course, the other project tied to the Atlantic is the European project, which was not initially conceived as such. I mean, all the early, usually conservative politicians who wanted to create a Europe, the Germans had their own very special reasons because they wanted to be part of a wider Europe to wipe out the stains and the memories of the Second World War. But de Gaulle had a very clear vision that this Europe was to be a Europe which was neutral in the battle between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, would be an independent Europe and would have its own independent positions. And the generation that followed de Gaulle in France, Jacques Delors' generation, argued for a social Europe, that it would be a social democratic Europe which would hold up a mirror to the world. Look, well, that project is over. And that project was systematically not permitted by the new leaders of Europe after the big collapse of 1991. So we now have a situation where there is unrest in Europe. It's very interesting. There was an article in Doesnt, the German weekly magazine, in which a correspondent, Doesnt correspondent wrote in the New York Times that there's a sort of strange volatility in Germany today. For instance, he pointed out, what shook me as a German was seeing the very detailed opinion polls from East Germany. And 70% of the East German people interviewed today said they preferred to live under the old system. Now, 70% is a huge figure. I could understand 40, even 50. But 70 is a huge figure. And then with that opinion poll, they did another one. What word comes to you when we say capitalism? And 83% in the former East Germany replied exploitation. And I think the figure in Western Germany was surprisingly high as well. It was between 25 and 35%. So if you add those up, it's quite huge. But the problem is that this clear anti-capitalist sentiment is not reflected politically as yet. Not in the extreme center parties and not even properly in the left parties. So people get fed up, they set up the pirates who don't say anything about their program, we're just against the system. They win big votes like the clowns in Italy, the five-star movement in Italy. And then you have the alternative, which is, more right-wing, semi-nationalist currents growing. So Europe really, you feel, is in a transition. And which is not the case with the United States, unfortunately. I mean, we sometimes have counterfactual arguments in the United States, like, what if the Civil War had not resulted in a clear victory? Would it have been such a bad thing to have two states, or three if you add Canada, in North America rather than a single state? And many people discuss this now quite seriously. The slavery thing doesn't impact because towards the end of the Civil War, the leadership of the South had said, okay, we're prepared to give up on slavery. Now just calm down and let's talk. But Lincoln, in this sense, was an extremely ruthless leader. He wanted to crush the Southerners forever, largely for economic reasons and to unite the country. So, but now you have movements in Texas of people saying, well, why shouldn't Texas go independent? And small groups in California. So there's tiny bits of unrest there which comes out in this way, or in this country with the huge vote for Scottish independence. And that's the continent we live in at the moment.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about Scotland.
About
Scotland.
Well, you see, the thing for me, I was very active in the Scottish campaign because they invited me to speak. And what was very noticeable was that though this campaign was for Scottish independence was vilified in the British press, and when I say British, I mean the British-Scottish press as well, 99 0.9% of the print media and television was totally against an independent Scotland, including The Guardian, which is getting worse and worse. And the arguments were nationalism is awful, nationalism is evil, etc., etc. There was hardly any nationalism in the campaign at all. That was so noticeable when I was there, that the arguments being put forward were, we don't want to be part of a neoliberal British structure, and we'd be better off on our own. We are already a bit better off than you, because we haven't allowed our hospitals to be treated as they are in England, and in the education system, our universities are in a better shape. It's all relative, but the small amounts of privileges Scottish people feel they do have a huge impact on them. And the Scottish National Party's campaign was social democratic. If you read what they said, or if you hear their leaders today, they sound pretty progressive. And then to the left of the SNP campaign, you had the Radical Independence campaign. That was set up by a few small groups, really, of leftists and far leftists. And that waged a campaign which really went into working class areas. Like the big campaign in Glasgow, which is the largest working class town in Scotland, was waged by the Radical Independence campaign. Many of them came from those families, and they went and explained and argued. So for Labour to be wiped out in Glasgow was a huge triumph. And the other aspect of it is because the SNP had argued, and the Scottish Parliament had passed a law that 16-year-olds could vote in the elections. You had something I have really never witnessed before outside either, liberation wars or semi-insurrections, is the involvement of young people. Everyone was talking politics. People were enthused. Even right-wing British politicians who went to campaign against came back saying, it's unbelievable, everyone's interested in politics. And not understanding that the reason everyone's interested in politics because they feel it's a chance to defeat people like these politicians who went. I mean, one amazing sort of vignette is that Labour, desperate for the Union, sent its virtually all its Scottish MPs to Glasgow to campaign. And two young people greeted them as they got off at New Street Station in Glasgow, where they were going to walk through the shops thinking people would come out and chat. Instead, one really brilliant activist accompanied them all the way with a mic and saying, people of Scotland, come and greet your occupiers from Westminster. And there were very few people to greet these charlatans. But when this guy started shouting, people began to gather to hear him and roaring with laughter the whole way through. So the campaign had a huge sense of humor. And the tune they played as these guys were getting off the trains was the Star Wars themes. So it was quite an exciting experience. And the last time I went was after the referendum. And the day I went to speak to a Radical Independence Assembly, and there 3,000 people had registered. More had registered, but we could only take 3,000 because that was the largest hall we could get. The SNP had booked the biggest hall in Glasgow to have what? A political discussion of what is to be done now, since we've lost the referendum. And there were 15,000 people at the SNP conference and 3,000 at the Radical Independence campaign. Now, you say 18,000 people on a rainy Saturday in Glasgow is quite astonishing, proportionate to the population in that country. And what I argued, and many people with me, that the key now was the May elections in Britain. And how should the extreme centre be defeated? And I said the only way to do it in Scotland is for the pro-independence parties to effectively, for this election, unite against behind the SNP, not put up their own candidates, because the other side is effectively doing the same, though they don't say it. And that, to my astonishment, was accepted. You know, lots of people said, yes, it's a good idea. Let's unite and see if we can defeat the main enemy. And then for the Scottish elections in June or whenever they are, then we can put up radical independence candidates to have people in the Scottish Parliament. But for Westminster, unite. So that was what the campaigning was about. And the politicians here had totally underestimated public anger in Scotland. They thought it would be a, easy victory. Then they got worried, and then the campaign of fear started. This is what will happen to you. You'll be finished. Your pensions won't be paid. We're going to do... And Gordon Brown and Labour played a big part in promoting that fear. And the dynamics of it were exactly the same as in the 2012 election in Greece, that the elderly sections of the population got scared. Syriza didn't win in 2012 precisely because of the campaign of fear waged by the European leaders and the European elite. In Scotland, it was really the same. And any big person coming to Britain, big in the sense of state guests, was asked to pronounce in Scotland. So the Chinese prime minister or president said, yes, please don't vote for independence in Scotland. Well, I can understand why they said it. They have problems in Xinjiang, they have problems in Tibet, and Han chauvinism is very deeply embedded in China. But every European leader came. Obama sent a message, don't vote for independence. Actually, all this backfired. Well, lots of people I talked to said, if they're pressing us not to vote for it, there must be something good about it. I'm not kidding. And the number of young people I overheard, on the streets, on trains, talking to each other, and expressing extreme sentiments like, oh God, my grandparents are voting for staying within Britain. They're pretty old. Why are they going to die? Why don't they die before the referendum? And that was astonishing to me. I mean, quite open discussions taking place about sort of euthanasia and things like this. So it was an experience which we haven't had in England for a very long time. We'll see. I mean, for me, the main thing when people here attacked me for supporting the Scots, I said, it's very simple for me. A, they'll create a better state on their own, I think, I hope. And secondly, it will weaken all the military pretensions of the British state, which pretends that it's still a huge power, though without the United States it's nothing. And pretends it's a sort of major player in the world when it isn't. People laugh at it in most parts of the world when Cameron speaks and, tries to be chauvinistic and jingoistic. It has no effect. In the Middle East, even though Britain has, sent army, people just laugh, saying it's, we prefer to deal with the organ grinder in Washington and not the monkeys in Europe. So it's all these things came out in the Scottish campaign, and I thought it was very positive, and we'll see. I mean, if, as the opinion polls are now saying, I can't totally believe it, because they can be exaggerated. But if they're true, if they're accurate now, Labour will win 2 or 3 seats in Scotland. That's a total wipeout of a political party, like PASOK in Greece. And then it'll be dependent on the SNP have said we're not sectarian people. If Labour is the largest political party and does something good, we'll vote for it. It'll be vote by vote. We're not going to give it blanket support. But Labour doesn't want that. They're dealing with the Lib Dems. You know, they want to keep the whole thing within the structures of the extreme centre.
So I think maybe now's a good time to hear questions and comments. And there's the one from Jan here anyway. Don't know who has the microphone. Okay, more and more lining up. Yeah. So Jan first, then.
Yes, that's a very sober analysis. But you're sending 2 messages. In what you said first, you said there is no contestation. The power is all there. And the power has become globalized. And don't underestimate their clout, their impact, etc. In the second part, either in Germany, both East and West, but also in Scotland, but also in the United States, the point you made is that the state has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And not only the state, also mainstream political parties and politics at large. There is a restiveness, and not only in Europe, but also in Europe.
Also in?
Also in Europe, not only in Europe, but
Yeah.
also in Europe, a restiveness, an atmosphere of resistance, of counter movement, which is not building up. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Why is it not gelling together? Why is it not building up? Why don't we see that restiveness in many segments of society? Why doesn't it gel?
I think that, you know, there was a few general elections ago in this country, there was a slogan chalked or painted on the walls in the East End, which is an anarchist slogan, but I think it expressed what young people thought quite effectively, that if voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. You know, I don't agree with that, by the way, but it did express a feeling that you can vote, but it doesn't change anything. And so it's the crisis of legitimacy of these political parties and the state, which exists all over, not just in Europe, but many different parts of the world. The question is, what alternative? And here we have to say that, and I think if we have to be very hard-headed about it, that at the moment, on a global scale, the only alternatives that have come into being, which I didn't discuss in the earlier, are the big South American movements, the Bolivarian republics, which were triggered off largely by neoliberalism, that in Venezuela, big uprising against the IMF, in Bolivia, huge uprisings against water privatization, in Peru against electricity privatization, in Ecuador against poverty, the rights of indigenous people. And with the triumph in Venezuela, first, you had for the first time a radical government, the Chavez government, in an oil-producing country, a large oil-producing country, which said, we are going to fund any government which carries out real reforms, not privatization as the word reform means now, but huge state spending on health, on education, on public housing. And in all these countries, when the governments were elected, for the first 5 years they did that. And people were shocked. I mean, pleasantly shocked, most people, that no governments had ever. So they kept on getting re-elected, despite US attempts to destabilize all these governments. The Brazilians didn't go that route. They had the Bolsa Familia family wage, which gave poor people in Brazil, and many, millions, a basic weekly wage. Tiny, but it had never been done before. The problem with that was that this was fine, but it didn't challenge the structures of neoliberalism in Brazil at all. That they didn't tamper with. Lula said to the Brazilian bourgeoisie, in so many words, I need money for the poor, and if you don't give it, I'll come after you. At a private meeting with big capitalists, and they agreed to it, they didn't challenge it. But of not having a social policy led to all the riots in Brazil last year, kids coming out and saying there's not enough money for education. So the point I'm making is that even in these countries where you had a combination of mass movements creating new political organizations, these organizations putting what we can only describe as a left social democratic program, but coming to power and then implementing that program. But left social democracy is not permitted today either. So it's not just Marx that was meant to be excluded, but also Polanyi.
During the last 2 days, we have talked a lot about public. And basically that is the organizing idea also of this conference. What constitutes public? Who is public? And for what?
Well,
and what we see is that public has faded away. Public space, public agency, public institutions are gone in this flexibilization drive, in this privatization drive. Why did Europe, which had built up public authority, you talked about railways, they were national railways, they have been privatized.
Yeah.
Is it more difficult where public space has gone to bring it back than to bring it where it has never been?
Yes. I think that is definitely the case, which is why these left social democratic governments in South America appeared revolutionary, because no governments like them had ever existed. I mean, the Cubans were a tiny island and the result of a revolution, but for the rest of Latin America, it hadn't existed like that. Here, they waged a huge campaign against the state, against state interventions, against the state doing anything to help alleviate the problems. And yet, their contradiction was, that when the 2008 crisis erupted, all these people who had been arguing that the state shouldn't do anything went on their knees and said, "State, please bail us out." So trillions and trillions of dollars were spent in bailing out capitalism. Trillions of taxpayers' money. Money which was not allowed to be used for helping or creating social structures or challenging privatization. Opinion polls in this country still show between 60 and 70% of the people to this day wanting the railways taken back. So it's a question of fight. And then the Syriza example, the two groups which emerged in Europe from the left are Syriza and Podemos in Spain. Podemos actually emerged from the occupations of the squares all over Spain. And at first decided what to do, should we form a party, not. Ultimately, they realized that you have to have something to challenge the rulers. And so Podemos was set up, and it immediately, the minute they set up a political party, it jumped virtually to the top of the polls in many different parts of Spain, including, not to the very top, but close to the top in Catalonia and Andalusia. Now, that is a huge shift. In Syriza, the problem is this, that it's not over. We shouldn't think it's over at all. The next 4 months, 5 months are pretty decisive. But the leadership did symbolic things which are not unimportant. The first thing Tsipras did was not to be sworn in by the Greek church, which is not a small act in that country. The second thing he did was to go to the tombs, the graves of the partisans in Greece, who had been virtually ignored by the other governments, and place a huge wreath as a symbol of the resistance in the Second World War. The finance minister, I almost said the fashion minister, Varoufakis took back the cleaning women who had been on strike because they had been sacked, and instead sacked some middle management people who were getting salaries without doing anything. Just to show, look, there's something new. But the key was the negotiations with Schäuble, the German finance minister. And, you know, he is a right-wing politician, very intelligent in my opinion, and defends the class interests of the German state as he sees fit. And Schäuble said, you're not getting anything from us. Right from the beginning. We made a deal with previous governments, and they said, yes, but you know, the Greek people have voted for us to end the debt, to break with the Troika. And he said, well, I understand the Greek people have voted for that, but I represent the German people. He said that. And he said, the German people have not voted for that, meaning, you know, jump if you want to. So the Syriza leadership had a number of options. I mean, the ultra option was to say, okay, as even Wolfgang Munkau, a Financial Times columnist, was advising them to do, saying, don't cave into the blackmail my countrymen are imposing on you. Say we quit the Eurozone, not Europe, the Eurozone, set up a Greek currency, Euro drachma, whatever you want to call it, print it as an internal currency, and use the euro just for foreign trade. And many other economists gave the same advice. It's a risk, but is it more risky than what is going on now? They didn't do that. Okay, one can sympathize, it's early days. But the worst thing the new government did, in my opinion, was to behave like traditional politicians when they went back home from the defeat and capitulation in Europe and told their people, we have won. And you know, I'd been arguing in the Greek press with them that one thing, we know it's a bad situation, but you must just always tell the people the truth. Say we were defeated, these are the reasons we were defeated, this is how we could go forward with your support, we can't do it without you, and if you permit us, this is what we suggest, here is plan B. That's the debate which is going on inside Syriza now. And interestingly enough, and shamefully, they didn't put the settlement, so-called settlement, to a parliamentary vote. Why? Because the extreme center party said they would vote for it. So this is the situation at the moment, and we hope it gets better. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about American hegemony.
Yes.
what's happening now, I think, is that countries like China, India, and Brazil, even if they are not growing as much as America, they are undergoing a process of social transformation, a kind of Polanyian moment in which social rights for the worker are being introduced. China is raising the wages of the workers. India, even in this moment of reactionary moment, has increased workers' rights. And in fact, America is now, Apple in America is re-internalizing work in America because American workers are cheaper than Chinese workers. So, and I wonder, what is the relationship, in your opinion, between economic growth and social unrest? Because I think that the capitalism of America is the only one that is where economic growth produces more poverty and more inequality, whereas the kind of neo-developmental capitalism of China, India, and Brazil are producing less inequality. So, if you say the future of the American, what will be the reaction of the American citizen, I think perhaps the reaction would be actually to start getting organized against very low wages, where increase inequality in America too. And maybe, I don't know, Oakland, Occupy, Ferguson, there is some unrest there.
Yeah. First, I really disagree with you fundamentally. It's best to be blunt. I don't think that China, the progress in China, is as it is painted out. It is, of course, in terms of the Chinese state, a huge leap forward, if one can use that phrase, for developing the economy, for bringing large numbers of people from the countryside into the towns. But the recent move, which is very recent, to give Chinese workers slightly more wages and marginally more social rights, does not change the overall pattern of China.
Was enough for Apple to
no,
analyze production?
and they move into Africa largely for reasons of trade. And they build the social structure needed to make sure that the trade flows are not impeded. But in terms of inequality, if you look at the figures, I think the figures of inequality in China are greater than in the United States of America. There are more billionaires and millionaires in China today, proportionate to the population, than there are in the United States.
But the trend is different. The trend is decreasing, obviously, because China is starting from a different position.
Yeah,
no?
it is, but you
and
still have a Chinese 1%.
Brazil is the only country in the world where inequality is decreasing.
Where?
Where inequality is decreasing, even
Brazil.
because obviously they are starting from such a,
Well, but it depends on how you analyze inequality. Okay? It's quite a ideological word. If you analyze inequality only on the basis of wages, then clearly there has been a decrease in China. Less so in India, in my opinion. But if you also put into the inequality indicator things like education, health, housing, then the gap is huge. China here has lost. It had a health system. It had a very good education system which educated millions of people from the working class and the peasantry, but millions and millions, without which the Chinese miracle, as it's called, would not have been possible. This is the huge difference between China and India. India did not build that same type of social infrastructure which the Chinese Revolution created. Partially explains the numbers of scientists, economists, mathematicians, etc., physicists produced in China from 49 to the late 80s and carried on being produced. That process is now stopped because effectively you have a much, much weaker educational system and health system in China. Many reports have been written, very brilliant Chinese Sociologists have written tomes on what is happening in China today. There is resistance, not on a national level, but you have big factory occupations, you have small peasant uprisings. There is unease, and the only way they can control it is by the single state, one-party structure, i.e. effectively a police state. In India, the situation, I can't give long talks on each of these countries now, but you know, in India, again you have two political parties. One has now been defeated, the other is pushing, both of them push through the same things, regardless of difference in ideologies. But in terms of the cities of India, you have to go and see them, you know, before you believe the statistics. The inequalities are huge. It's true that Indian middle class obviously has been created, but that is even true in a country like Pakistan, which hasn't had huge economic developments. On the real scale of everything, I think these countries are in a mess. And I pointed out about Brazil that the Bolsa Familia wasn't enough to do the trick. And the lowering now of oil prices affects everyone. China benefits, actually. Sorry?
Dilma Rousseff was re-elected because of the Bolsa Familia.
Yeah, I know, of course. It's, as I said, it's better than nothing, the Bolsa Familia.
It was huge.
Huge, but it's not structural. No, that's the problem.
So we have up here, actually.
Sorry to jump again very much, but coming back to Scotland or to the Scottish. So what I found very interesting was one interview on TV when before the referendum, and it was one woman saying, whatever happened, there had been, and you were talking about that, there had been politicization of the people. Which will not be possible to undo. So, which is a very important thing, and I think this politicization that you described goes far beyond any referendum or any vote. But does it still is an issue? Do you still observe this politicization of the population in? So I'm back in Scotland. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. So I mean, we are very close still to that referendum, but and you described that all these people were meeting. So what's going on? Can you see something already? How this politicization maybe creates, besides of what is going to happen with the vote? So just for a political discourse, do you see something going on?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the political discourse is still very strong in Scotland. I mean, if you visit it, if you visit Scotland just as a visitor and hang around cafes and places like that in the main cities, and not even in all the main, even in smaller cities, the discourse is very political. And it's very different from the discourse in England, precisely because of this experience they've had. And the frisson it created that if only we had fought a bit harder, we might have won. And many people who voted against independence are now publicly saying they regret it. And so the May elections are going to be quite crucial, because all these debates are taking place even as we speak. The interesting thing, of course, is that very little of this was reflected in the main television networks or the mainstream media. There was one newspaper in Scotland, the Herald on Sunday, which supported independence. All the other papers owned, and television networks, the BBC and the private networks, masterminded from London, were against. So despite that, they came close. And I always use these examples because sometimes people get very worked up about the media. I mean, I do too, because I hate most of it. But the idea that it's all powerful is wrong. it can be transcended, has been transcended in South America, was almost transcended in Scotland. In Greece, the bulk of the print media was against Syriza, attacking very viciously and unpleasantly, and still they won. And you know, that's a sign that one can't sort of, there is no real substitute for politics and political movements, however they start and where they go.
So we take maybe 2 more questions because we're running over time. So, and then thank you as well.
I have a few things to say, but I think I'll just focus it on.
You speak into the mic.
Okay. It's really okay. I'm curious to know whether you would suggest to opt out rather than like preemptively, such as the draft dodgers did, right? When they left America and they went to Canada. And so they infrastructurally changed some politics, right? So would that be an option, or should one, in fact, for example, when this neo-Nazi march in Germany, and a leftist grassroots activist group ended up sponsoring for each step they took. So each step they took ended up raising so much money that that march will never happen again. So that's another way of acting, right? So there's many different ways of acting. So I was just curious what you would suggest.
I'm not sure I totally understood the last part of your question.
The march, you mean the sponsorship? Or
No, the draft dodging thing you mentioned, I understand.
yeah.
But what did you say after that?
In a small town in Germany, there was a march that happened repeatedly.
In Dresden?
Was it?
Yeah, it's not such a small town.
It wasn't interesting. It wasn't interesting.
It started, the first march of Pegida was in Dresden.
Okay.
Sorry?
This is not the Pegida, I think this is something else.
Oh, I see, okay.
I forget. I forget the name of the town. Sorry, but all to say, there was a grassroots activist group that decided the way that they would stop this march is by sponsoring each step. Literally, each step was counted. So then they realized that as soon as they started marching, they couldn't stop because that would obviously be counter to their ideology. But it was just the clapping would just make them really confused, and they just kept going. And anyways, they finally managed to stop this march from happening over and over again. So I'm just curious, would you suggest to opt out, or would you suggest to sort of enact within the systems that is already there? You know what I mean? Like sponsorship. Yeah.
Well, look, I'll answer this as best I can. As far as draft dodging is concerned, the question doesn't arise now because there's no draft. And the one thing the United States learned from the Vietnam War, which was not foolish from their own point of view, was that they analyzed the anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s as a movement which in the United States was largely helped by the draft. And that's true. Because the fact that any young man, in those days women weren't in the army, that any young man was had to serve in the army unless he was a member of the Bush family, but meant that every single household in the United States was discussing the war. That politicized America because of the draft. What is this war? Why are we fighting it? What's going on? Are we going to win? When will we win? Are we going to be defeated? So the Americans abolished the draft, and they have never attempted it again. So now you have two developments. One is, of course, the increasing use of technology like drone warfare, so you don't have too many soldiers on the ground. The other is mercenaries, privatizing the armies by hiring mercenaries, most of whom commit crimes on a huge order and can't be dealt with. The American state says, well, we aren't directly responsible for them. But the number of mercenaries fighting in the Iraq War were the third largest. The US Army was first, the British the second, mercenaries the third. And then you had the other members of the coalition of the willing, crucial states such as Georgia, Romania, who all wanted to be part of the war. So the draft has gone. In terms of how you combat fascism, it's a tactical question, in my opinion. It'll be different in different countries. But I think in order to understand what we are fighting, it's extremely vital to see something that the left, but not just the left, liberals as well, more or less forgot about after the Second World War. They assumed that, as was being said in the session before me, that the military victories against fascism had done the trick, and that right-wing ideology of that extreme nature had ceased to exist, and this was false. And this extreme rightist ideology, by the way, before the war, in the 20s and early 30s, was stronger in France than even in Germany. The French right were the real thinkers of extreme right-wing ideology, whether you want to call it fascism or whatever. That never went away, was strong. And in Germany it was defeated. In France it's not talked about much, more now, but the French collaborated with the Reich, Third Reich during the Second World War. The resistance was very tiny. It's extremely important to understand that. The countries where the resistance was strong was Greece and Yugoslavia. Even there, the right fought back with the occupying Germans. In France, the resistance was very weak, initially set up by Britain, subsequently the Communist Party, but as far as the majority of the population was concerned, it was not a huge success. Now, of course, people imagine everyone was in the resistance. Not the case. And the other point worth bearing in mind, that because even before the World War came to an end, the United States were already preparing the next war against communism, which was called the Cold War, but it was actually a very hot war. They decided to keep many of the fascist personnel in place. In Germany, it was up to 50% of people who had been judges, teachers, military intelligence, police officials under the Third Reich were preserved and maintained. In Italy, the figure is higher. Nearly 70% of Mussolini's people were maintained and kept in running the Italian state to fight against the new enemy. In Vietnam, which wanted to be free and almost became free in 1945, the British tried to preserve the colonial order. Japanese troops were released to help defeat the Viet Minh. So it was a sister, and in Japan, of course, the United States preserved the emperor, who was the main war leader of the Japanese state, precisely in order to fight the new wars which they had been thinking about for some time. In the Ukraine, just so we know, the Ukraine was the one area in the Soviet Union where you had real Ukrainian forces fighting with the Third Reich. after the Second World War, most of these people were kept on. The American scholars have written books on this now. Most of these Ukrainians were kept on, put on the payroll of the United States to create instability in the region. And the amount of money spent was quite phenomenal. And to this day now, where the Ukraine is hotted up again, they're quite happy to pour in billions to sustain that state. Billions, which is money which will never be returned, while the Greeks are punished. So, these are the priorities of this new disordered world in which we live. And they have to be challenged in different ways, politically, ideologically, on the streets, and increasingly they are being challenged, and slowly in some places, at a faster pace in others. But the debate is there. And once again, questions are being raised of was it such a huge triumph in 1991? That we destroyed these, what I call social dictatorships, if you like. One-party state, but a lot of benefits for the population, and replaced them with free market, so-called free market society, which is not producing what it was intended to produce, or what people were promised it would produce. So there is a great deal of conflict. I'd strongly recommend those of you who like the cinema to see this Russian film, Leviathan. It's a very powerful film of what happened to that society. And to my astonishment, it's a very strong critique of the collaboration of the Russian Orthodox Church and the political system and large-scale corruption. And there are many, many good things in it, which is gives one some hope that old tradition of Russian cinema is being revived under these new conditions. Okay, I stop.
Yeah, I think we'll have to stop here actually because we're so behind
no.
time. Or do you have a very brief question?
Yeah.
Sorry, and I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, it's me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just about the PKK and Rojava and what we can learn from that.
The what?
The PKK and Rojava. What can we learn? What can be learned?
I think that the Kurds, in many ways, used to be, certainly, for many decades, the most progressive force in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that. Then with the Iraq, the first Gulf War, the protection given to the Iraqi Kurds by the United States, and the Iraqi Kurds always had more rights, by the way. They had their own language, their own press, their own books, their own schools in Iraq, which they were never allowed in Turkey till much, much, much later. The repression of the Kurds in Turkey was on a much higher scale than either in Iran or in Iraq or in Syria. And it's an interesting question why a Kurdish state was never created after the First World War. It could easily have been. I'm not saying it would have been great, but at least those aspirations would have been fulfilled. Now the Kurds are divided. The Iraqi Kurds are quite happy to function effectively as an Israeli-American protectorate. The Turkish Kurds have resisted. At times the government has given concessions, but these concessions have not meant very much. But even in Turkey, I remember going to speak in Diyarbakir, the Kurdish capital in eastern Turkey. And it's a very large audience, and I was speaking on the Iraq war, so it must have been 2004, thereabouts. And as I was speaking, I suddenly found a sort of strange atmosphere building up. And in the question time, it came out. The bulk of them were for the Iraq war. And so we had a ferocious question and answer session, but really ferocious, with me arguing against the Iraq war and the Turkish Kurdish population, or segment of it which was their intellectuals, poets, arguing for, because they thought, and they said it, They said, okay, we know the Americans are awful, but they're going to give us independence. And I said, if you think the Americans regard you as more important than the Turkish military, which is a central part of the eastern flank of NATO, you're living in cloud cuckoo. But we hear from our Iraqi Kurds. I said, that's very different. You will never, ever get it. I mean, this argument carried on till midnight in cafes, in restaurants, and people were coming up in chairs. Again, very politicized. But that was the hope, that maybe it would be given to us on a plate as a byproduct of the Iraq war, so support the war.
And what about Rojava specifically and the way that they...
No, that's very different. You know, and now what's happened in Kobani, etc., shows that in this nightmare state that has been created as a result, really, of large-scale Western interventions, the Kurds represent the most enlightened layers, which is why they've been protecting Christians, other ethnic minorities, etc., etc. But whether it will lead to anything seems unlikely. You know, that is the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. And,